Hello, and welcome to a very short presentation on Merleau-Ponty. I'm Sean Gallagher. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Memphis. And Professor Tollefson asked me to do a very short, kind of 10-minute or so introduction to Merleau-Ponty's philosophy. So let's see if we can do that. Okay, so here's an outline we'll try to follow. I'll just say a little bit about Merleau-Ponty at first. I'll focus in on the idea of the body as he proposes to understand it as the body as subject. I'll focus in a little bit further on a particular conception called the body schema. I'll point out that there is some ambiguity here, that the body is both a subject and an object. And then I'll come to something, what we could call a critical perspective using the work of Frantz Fanon. And I think this will kind of set things up for your later discussion of Jung. Okay, so Merleau-Ponty, born in 1908, died in 1961 at a relatively young age. You'll notice he has a bad habit of smoking, and in fact, it was lung cancer that he got and that he died from. He was a French philosopher, an existentialist, a phenomenologist, who was a contemporary and, in fact, a friend with some other philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. He was very much influenced by phenomenology and specifically by Edmund Husserl's phenomenology. But also, Merleau-Ponty studied Gestalt psychology and neurology. And so he supplemented his understanding of phenomenology with these other disciplines. So he was a very interdisciplinary thinker. And perhaps more than any other thinker, he was regarded as the philosopher of the body. Okay, so in terms of his focus on the body, what he was opposing was a kind of Cartesian mind dualism. So Merleau-Ponty argued that our experience, our perception, our cognition, these things are fully embodied, that the body plays an important role, and that they should not be thought of simply as in the head, mental, purely mental processes. So the idea that that cognition is fully embodied means that cognitive processes are not divorced from bodily processes. And those bodily processes include a variety of things such as autonomic, endocrine, affective or emotional systems. But there was special emphasis placed on motoric processes, bodily movement, for example, by Merleau-Ponty. So in some sense, Merleau-Ponty foreshadowed and in certain ways inspired what is now called embodied cognition in the broader realm of cognitive science. And specifically, he foreshadowed the notion of what today we call inactive perception. This idea actually goes back to Edmund Husserl again. In one of his works, Husserl talked about perception in terms of a kind of pragmatic grasp on the world. I perceive objects in terms of what I can do with them. This shapes the way we perceive the world. So we perceive the world in a very pragmatic fashion. According to Husserl, he referred to this as the I can. And a little bit later, a psychologist influenced by Merleau-Ponty, actually, James Gibson, has this nice term for this phenomenon. He referred to this as a perception based on affordances. Certain things in the environment afford us a certain action. So we perceive those things in terms of what they afford. It's pretty much the same idea. We find it in Husserl, we find it in other phenomenologists, including Merleau-Ponty. A specific concept that he thought was very important was something that he found or picked up from the British neurologist, Sir Henry Head. And this is what Head called the body schema. Head defined the body schema as a system that kept track of posture and bodily movement based on proprioceptive, kinesthetic, vestibular processes, sensory processes about body position, bodily movement. And the vestibular is about balance. All of these things, according to Head, contributed to motor control. And Merleau-Ponty took this idea. He also studied cases of apraxic patients, so patients with problems moving, in order to show that disturbances in body schematic processes disrupted a basic bodily intentionality, and thereby all kinds of cognitive and affective functions that have a really profound effect on a patient's life, a patient's practical and intersubjective and sexual practices are basically tied to problems perhaps that patient is having with body schematic processes, control of movement, which is very closely connected again with perception. So Merleau-Ponty's account then focused on what phenomenologists refer to as the body as subject, and then on the neurological and psychological details of body schematic processes. He conceived of the body schema as functioning without perceptual monitoring in a non-conscious way. We don't have to be conscious of our body in order to move in ways that serve our pragmatic interests. So, for example, you can think if you hear a knock on the door and you're sitting there and you want to get up and answer the door. Well, you get up and you walk across the room and you grab the doorknob and open the door. And in doing this, you don't have to think about, first of all, now how am I going to get up out of this chair? Or, you don't have to pay any attention to your feet as you're walking across the room. In fact, some people claim if you start paying too much attention to your movements, your performance declines. As you reach out to grasp the doorknob, you don't have to pay any attention to the shape of your hand or precisely, how you're going to reach the doorknob. All of these things are in some way taken care of by the body in a kind of non-conscious, we don't think about it way. Body schematic processes then function, according to Merleau-Ponty, as a kind of pre-personal system, such that we cannot, so that we could basically forget about the body and just kind of let it do its thing. And we can be more focused on and attending to other things that interest us rather than just our own body as we engage in action in everyday life. Now, disruptions in such processes then, as is in the case of aplasia, may disrupt a person's social life in some way. And Merleau-Ponty talked about examples of this. But Merleau-Ponty did not consider, or at least he did not discuss, the idea that social and cultural factors might affect the body schema that could go the other direction. Well, let me just qualify and complicate that last statement. Merleau-Ponty certainly did know that there was a complicated set of perspectives that are involved in bodily existence. So he focused on body as subject, or what Edmund Husserl called the lived body. But the phenomenologists, including Merleau-Ponty, also knew that the body was an object as well, that we can take our body as an object. Husserl called this the objective body. And it turns out that the body as object is also in some way the body as it is perceived by others from a third person perspective, right? So if we pay attention to our body and see it as a kind of object, we can do that. And it's something like how other people might attend to our body. The body for others, then, which is what Jean-Paul Sartre called it, the body for others is not something, it doesn't involve a kind of neat correspondence between body as subject and body as object, but rather it sort of tells us about a kind of ambiguity that we are both subject and object in the world. And sometimes that ambiguity is the important part. Despite that ambiguity, the body can function positively in intersubjective interactions. Merleau-Ponty talked about a kind of intercorporeity, which might be the case in things like joint action. It might also be something that functions to support empathy, and so forth. So it's not, it's something important here, even despite the ambiguity that's involved. Let's take a look at what Judith Butler has to say just about this particular idea. She's talking about Merleau-Ponty, and this is just not even a 2-minute video clip.
With Merleau-Ponty, as you remember, the entire idea of correlation proves impoverished in light of the embodied character of consciousness. For the salient problem for him is neither that the world is structured in such a way that I may know it, nor that my modes of knowing are structured in such a way to adequately apprehend the world. Rather, I am, as a body, part of the world I seek to know, already over there, seen, mobile, and mattering. The spatial limits of the perceived body belie its proper reach, for it is always both here and there, rooted and transported. The world that is usually assumed to be over there or around me is in fact already in and on me, and there is no easy way around that form of adherence. My reflexivity, my capacity to see or feel myself, oscillates between subject and object poles of experience. And in I and Mind, an essay by Merleau-Ponty, he puts it this way, and I quote, "My body simultaneously sees and is seen. That which looks at all things can also look at itself and recognize in what it sees the other side of its power of looking. It sees itself seeing. It touches itself touching. It is visible and sensitive to itself. It is a self lacking transparency through confusion, narcissism, through inherence of the one who sees in that which one sees, and through the inherence of sensing in the sensed. A self, therefore, that is caught up in things, that has a front and a back, a past and a future."
Butler is here talking about this ambiguity that, as I said, can function positively in intersubjective interactions, but we should note that it may work in a more negative way if others reify or objectify your body. And this is something that Jean-Paul Sartre has described very nicely in his account of bad faith. But this particular point did not really get worked back into Merleau-Ponty's analysis of the body schema. Even if he was aware of it, he didn't seem to understand it in terms of body schematic processes. Here, Fanon, I think, is a big help. Frantz Fanon is a philosopher and psychiatrist, a friend of Sartre. He developed a political critique of colonial and racist practices in Martinique, where he was from, and at the time of the French-Algerian context after World War II. Part of this entailed a philosophical critique of Merleau-Ponty's concept of the body schema. And so Fanon writes in a work called Black Skin, White Masks, he says, in the white world, the man of color encounters difficulties in elaborating his body schema. Consciousness of the body is solely a negating activity. It is a third-person consciousness rather than a non-conscious functioning. A slow composition of myself as a body in the middle of a spatial and temporal world. Such seems to be the schema, a definitive structuring of the self and of the world. So Fanon emphasizes the idea that social and specifically racist distortions can impinge on the body schema. He continues, below the corporeal schema, I had sketched a historico-racial schema. The elements that I used had been provided for me not by residual sensations and perceptions, primarily of a tactile, vestibular, kinesthetic, and visual character, which is the way that Merleau-Ponty was describing it, but rather by the other, the white man, who had woven me out of 1,000 details, anecdotes, stories. I thought that what I had in hand was to construct a physiological self, to balance space, to localize sensations. And here I was really caught within the gaze of the other. This impingement is mediated specifically by the way others, in this case, white people, perceive Fanon's body, or by the way that Fanon becomes self-conscious of his body under their gaze, which then may lead to awkward or difficult or stilted or constrained movements or movement styles. Or it could lead to reactive gaits, movement styles, and gestures that protest such white gazes and that may become part of a culture or a style of movement. One way or the other, this is a historical racial schema rather than a neatly delineated physiological body schema of the sort described by Merleau-Ponty. It gets defined by a limited or different set of affordances, to use Gibson's term. It's more about what I can't do rather than what I can do. From Fanon's perspective, it's more about what a Black man cannot do in a white society. And this really has an effect upon the way he moves and his body schematic processes. So finally, then, I hope this prepares a bit for your reading of Iris Marion Young, and I think you might be able to see some connections in her work. Iris Young, as well as Fanon, today they fall under the heading of critical phenomenology. There are other feminists like Gail Weiss, Lisa Gunther, Mariana Ortega, other race theorists like Lewis Gordon, George Yancey, and they also kind of come under this heading of critical phenomenology, which takes a critical look at cultural practices that may involve sexism, racism, and so forth. Okay, good luck with the rest of your reading.